So in the last lesson, we looked at how we're able to change the background color of the body of our web page by simply injecting CSS code in the same line as our body HTML element. Now, in this lesson, we're going to look at how we can implement CSS code across the entire web page, so we won't have to copy and paste the style attribute each time we want to change a particular element. So in order to do this, we're going to go into the head section of our HTML page, and just below the title, I'm going to add a style tag, and I'm going to close it off as well. Now, in between the style tag, I'm going to select the HTML element that I want to affect. So let's first try this with our body element. So in order to select an HTML tag, all you have to do is specify the name of the element you want to change, which in this case is the body, and then you're going to create a set of curly braces, inside which you're going to write your CSS code that will affect the style of the body element. So let's hit enter and give ourselves a bit more space. And let's also indent this so that it's nested inside our style tag. So here I can copy this line of code straight in like so. So the essential elements of any CSS code that you're going to write is going to be something that you want to affect. So in this case, it's the body of the page that we want to change. And then it's what you want to change about it. So in this case, it's the background color property that we want to affect. And finally, what is the value that you're going to change it to, which in this case is that nice color from our color palette. So I want to go ahead and just change this to a more obvious color. So back to that pretty ugly blue looking color that we had before. And I'm going to delete our inline CSS here and make it go back to just a simple body tag, just so that we can confirm that our code is in fact working. So now if we hit save and we go back to our website and we hit refresh, you can see that that change has worked. So we know that our CSS code is functional and it is working. Now, sometimes when you're linking up CSS with your HTML file, you might have forgotten a closing tag, or you might have put it into the wrong place. For example, you accidentally had it inside the body instead of the head section. And there's all sorts of reasons why your CSS and your HTML might not be linked together. So it's always a good idea just to change something really, really dramatic so that you can just confirm that the entire style tag is working and it's affecting the appearance of your web page. So now let's change this back to that prettier color that we had, and let's check to make sure that it's working. And the next thing that we're going to change is what we mentioned before. We want to change the style of something that occurs repeatedly in our code, which is the horizontal rule. Now, instead of having to write the style attribute inside each and every single one of these tags, what I can do is I can simply select it here by saying, let's change the style of all the horizontal rules. And the property of the horizontal rule that I want to change is also its background color. I don't like this grayish thing that we've got here, and I want it to just be pure white. So I want its background color to be simply just white, a CSS color that we can have access to just by writing the keyword white. So if we hit save and we head over to our website, you'll notice that nothing changes when you refresh it. It hasn't changed in its appearance at all. So why is that? Well, it's really, really important to realize that no website is completely unstyled. So what does that mean? Even before we've added any CSS code to our index.html, there is already some default CSS being applied by your browser. Now, you can find out what the default CSS looks like by, again, searching for it. So let's search for browser default CSS and hit enter. And you can see that the first thing that we get is actually from W3 Schools. So I'm pretty agnostic towards which sources we use as long as they're useful. And Google's always pretty good at picking out which is the most used, or rather most useful links, and put them at the top of your searches. So if we look inside W3 Schools, you can see that all these elements have default CSS values being applied by your browser. Now, if we hit Command F to find the horizontal rule, then you can see all the default CSS that it has. Now, let me just talk you through what all of this does. Now, the first thing is that it sets a margin for our horizontal rule, and then it sets the type or the style of our border to something called Inset. And then it gives the border a width of 1 pixel. So what is this border style inset? Well, let's take a look at border style CSS using MDN. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of different keywords that you can use that changes the border style. Now you'll also find the default one, which is the inset border style. And this displays a border that makes the element look embedded. And if you look really closely at our border, it's kind of got that effect, right? Even though it's not that nice looking, that happens to be the default style that's specified by our browser. So let's change it to something that we want. Well, we actually don't really want a border. All we want is just to have a single line without a border that is white in color, right? So we can change the border style to none, and we can override the default browser value by specifying a new value for it using CSS. So we're going to say border style to none. And if we hit save, something surprising is going to happen when you refresh your website. Your horizontal rules have disappeared. Now, why is that? Well, one of the most important concepts in learning CSS is realizing that pretty much everything that exists on the web page are essentially just boxes. And I can make those boxes appear by using this Chrome plugin I've got, which is called Pesticide. And it highlights all of the boxes that we have on screen. Now, the horizontal rule is no exception. It's also just a rectangle. And that rectangle used to have a border specified by this border style. And that border had a width. So it was 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the bottom, 1 pixel on the left, and 1 pixel on the right. Now, by getting rid of that border, by setting border style to none, our rectangle now has no size. It's literally 0 pixels high. So in order to change this situation, we need to change some of the CSS for the box to give it a height. So if you head over to devdocs.io and you search for height, the first one, the blue icon here, shows you that this is CSS related documentation. And if you click on it, it takes you to this height CSS property. And this specifies the height of an element. And you can read that as this thing changes the height of your box. So if we now give our horizontal rule a height, let's say 2 pixels, and we hit save, once we hit refresh, our box now has an actual dimension. And you can see that here as well. You can see that that tiny box now has a little bit of height associated with it, whereas previously it had 0 pixels in height, because only the border had a dimension to it. Now, that height property isn't unique to just the horizontal rule. And this is the really interesting thing about CSS. Now, once you realize that essentially everything in your web page is just a whole bunch of boxes, and the properties of these boxes can be affected by changing the CSS code, then you can pretty much apply the same rules or the same changes to any of these boxes you choose. So for example, if I wanted to select my image HTML element, then I could write image and I can change its height to something less extreme, maybe something like 20 pixels. And if I hit save and refresh, then you'll see that the box for my image has now become super tiny, and it is now only 20 pixels high. Now, some of you might have tried to change the height of the body, and you might have gotten stuck and wondered, why did it not work for the body? Well, it's down to the fact that the body has some default values that prevents our changing the height. And we're going to look at some of those things like display block in later lessons in this module to understand why that is. But for now, let's get rid of this style that we applied to the image, and let's hit save, and let's see our website as it is. Now, if you go into DevDocs and you go to the CSS section, then you can look at all of these subsections of how you can change the appearance of any element. So one of the things that you can change, in addition to the height, is actually the width of your element. So we can go and say the width of our horizontal rule should only ever be 100 pixels. And we hit save and we refresh, then you see that this is 100 pixels wide. Now, sometimes you might want the width to change depending on whether if you're viewing your website on a smartphone or whether if you're viewing on a browser or if somebody's viewing it maybe on an iPad. So you might not want to specify a straight up hard-coded value such as 100 pixels. You can also specify a percentage. So you can say the width should be 30% of the entire width of the web page. Now, when you hit refresh, you can see that that line is much wider when our entire page is wider, and when our page gets narrower, it always remains 30% of the entire width. So that's another way that you can specify a size. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use this page on MDN, the border style property, and looking at all the different types of border styles, I want you to be able to make this line similar to what Sean has here, which is just a few gray dots, maybe 3 or 4, or maybe just 10% of the page. So pause the video and see if you can change the CSS in order to make that line look like this. All right, so how did that go? Now, in order to make our horizontal rule look similar to this, we know that we can change the border style. And one of those styles is the dotted style. And MDN very helpfully has this interactive box where we can change the properties of these borders. So we already know that we can't have a border to be set to none. We're going to need it to be dotted. But if we simply change this border style to dotted and hit save, then you can see if I zoom in that yes, I have a border that's dotted around my horizontal rule, but this looks nothing like what he's got over here. So how can we change this? Well, if we only want to have a single border, then we have to turn our height down to 0 again. So we have a box that's 0 pixels high that only has a border. So you can either change the height to 0 pixels or delete it outright, and that will also make it 0 pixels high. Now if I refresh, you can see that we've now got a horizontal rule that's 0 pixels high, and we've got a border around it. So if we have a look here at the syntax section, it says that when one value for border style is specified, then it applies the same style to all 4 sides. And that's pretty much what we're getting here. We're getting that dotted style across all 4 sides. Now, when we specify 2 values, then the first style is applied to the top and bottom borders, and the second to the left and right. When 3 values are specified, then the first one applies to the top, the second to the left and the right, and the third to the bottom. Or you can also specify all 4 values of all 4 sides. So knowing this, we can actually change our border style to dotted. So that gets applied to the top border, and then we can specify none for the rest of the borders. And if we hit save, we go back over here, we refresh, you see that we now only have the top border showing. Now, an alternative way that you might have worked out is by simply changing the border top style. So we could say that the entire border style is none, but the border top style is going to be dotted. And if you hit save and you refresh, you can see that it's exactly the same effect. Because we're specifying something that is more specific than this property, we're affecting only this particular thing. And now our background color is redundant because our main box has no background because it has no height. So we can get rid of that. Now, in order to make this line look more like this line, we have to change the size of the dots and also the color of the dots. And you can see that we can change the color by simply changing the border color property. So we can change it to gray, and we can also change the border width. So if we say 20 pixels, then the dots get a lot bigger, whereas 5 pixels, you only get very tiny dots. So let's go over here and add some more properties that we want to change. So we're going to change the border color to gray, and we're going to change the border height, and then we're going to change the border width to, let's try 20 pixels. And let's see what that now looks like. Ooh, that's absolutely massive. And our border is still black. So what's going on here? It's because we have a typo in the word gray. And you can see that using our packages that we've installed in Atom, when it's actually a valid color code, it gets highlighted in a different color compared to something that doesn't exist. So let's change that down to maybe, let's try 10 pixels. And that is now looking pretty similar to that size. Maybe smaller still, maybe 5 pixels. Yeah. That looks pretty similar. And we can change it down to be a lot smaller in width as well. So let's say maybe put the width as maybe 10% or even smaller, maybe 5%. Yeah, that looks pretty decent. So we've now more or less implemented what we see over here simply by changing the CSS style of our horizontal rule. Now, there's still a bit of a problem though, because we've changed our horizontal rule to look exactly the way that we want it to. And we of course want this to be consistent across our website. And we also want our background color to carry over to all our other web pages on our website. But if we look inside my hobbies or contact me, it still looks exactly the same way as it did before. And we're going to have to copy this entire style section over to the contact me header as well as the hobbies header. So that's kind of a lot of work, especially if you end up with a website with, 200 pages. Then it's not a good idea to have to copy this over and change it in every single place. This might be easier than using inline CSS as we did in the last lesson, but it's still quite repetitive. What we really want is to have a single location where when we change the CSS styles in that one location, then everything gets reflected across our website in all of the pages. So that is what we're going to learn about in the next lesson, where we look into how we can create external CSS for our website. So stay tuned, and I will see you in the next lesson.